Opposite my old high school, Plato College Sharam, is a big mountain called Gallant. That mountain has a significant history in Ngas land, but I didn't know that at the time. On several occasions, myself and other students had gone up that mountain on expeditions. I later found out that it was on the same mountain that the Battle of Sharam took place between the army of Pang, led by the great JASH, and the British Royal Army when they invaded Yil Ngas. It was at this same place that the great JASH died as he fought to defend his homeland. Last year, I was fortunate to revisit that place and interview some Ngas elders, which culminated into this amazing documentary that I would love to share with you. This is our story, but let us begin with a little history on the origin of the Ngas people.
Vision no more way home mudum kung a mountain to cabin way in the Ramajumuru. Lantana Vision Fara Dapkun Karma Yalgamama Banyuru Kiru Kunkarmami, Pomayal de Gaborno, Pomajumoro Ukari, Mayal Ukari, Mti much of a picture, one out a bill. Mayan bill, Omake Maron Kadang Manam Prata Kurki Omayalgi Goma Chirma Jimini Omajimaton Omayar Mun Kat Pirinia Chinchini.
The migration story of the Ngas people from Yemen to present-day Yil Ngas, as passed down through oral tradition and documented by the people, shows close ties between Yil Ngas and its neighbors. And through the years, as they settled and established the Ngas nation, it becomes evident that the Ngas people are very resilient and strong warriors, attributes that came in handy when dealing with local and foreign intruders or invaders.
Until the white man came, the Hausa Fulani were unable to conquer the territory. They could not. They could not. In fact, they were the ones who pointed at us, to the white man. And they were the ones who led the white man into our territory, coming through Tafa Balewa local government area, the Sayawa or the Za people, coming through Dawaki, that's Poel, and then through Kabir. So they were the ones who pointed at the direction of Pang, all right, from there.
The first contact between the colonial invaders and Yil Ngas, as recorded by the colonialists, was in February 1902. This contact was said to be a spying expedition on Yil Ngas by the colonialists.
The British colonialists first heard of the Ngas people in February 1902, when they had already established a base in Bauchi. Since then, they tried to send emissaries of tax collectors under the assumption that the Ngas were formerly under the tutelage of Bauchi Emirate.
According to colonial records and oral tradition, the British colonialists first spied over Ngas land way back in 1902, coming from Bauchi, which was their colonial headquarters. And in 1902, they came just out on spying the land, because they had only heard about the Ngas people. They hadn't really entered any part of Ngas land. that the real expedition to invade Gasland, to subdue Gasland, as you must be aware, their intention was actually to subdue the entire territory for their economic benefit.
In 1884 to 85, Otto von Bismarck, the first Chancellor of Germany, organized the Berlin Conference, also known as the Congo Conference or the West African Conference, which can be seen as the formalization of the Scramble for Africa. In that conference, Africa was partitioned and divided among the new imperialists. In 1870, only 10% of Africa was under formal European control. By 1914, this had increased to almost 90% of the continent, with only Ethiopia, formerly known as Abyssinia, the Dervish state, a portion of the present-day Somalia, and Liberia still being independent. This gives a background on how the imperialists would come into a village in Nigeria with the feeling of right to ownership, forcing natives to give up their crops in the name of taxation, and when they refused to pay, their farms, barns, and homes were burned, and their rulers abducted until payments were made. This was bold-faced daylight robbery practiced by the British in Yil Ngas and parts of Africa, and the abduction was nothing more than kidnap for ransom.
In April 1906, the resident or governor, Colonel Oliver Howard, decided to lead an expeditionary invasion against the Ngas people. It lasted for 2 weeks. They arrived on the 18th of April 1906 and left on the 2nd of May 1906. During the expedition, they came to Met. From Met, they went to Nemer, which in colonial records they called Kabara, while Met they called Goshinduse.
They undertook the first invasion in 1906. And for about 4 days, they attempted to subdue Ampang.
They fought with people at Nyeleng, at Goshinduse or Met. They only collected taxes. And the second place where they could have fought was in Ampang East. But the king and his aristocrats used diplomatic suspense in keeping the attackers at bay. So after a long debate, it was agreed that Pang should be left. They would come back someday to collect the tax.
The British colonialists were blinded by their arrogance during the invasion of Yil Ngas. They underrated the Ngas army and underestimated their resolve to defend their homes. But also, during the first expedition, while the British soldiers were camped at Sharam, the Pan commander JASH has sent spies to walk among the British Army formation. They brought back report about the strength of the British Royal Army and their firepower. The spies erroneously thought that the muskets they saw were just sticks and reported back as such. That was a costly error.
Nasaraji tir Sharam. Kuma ya mamata du chan dambira. Ba akwai gurum we daga jina. Ba dok numbi chinpan onara omalebni. Ba men watungwa ni morang makan kenbi makan bilir dang mai. Ne yalmet ko men ner kuma ba nasaranya kulanya ba. Timani chin araba ma malek ka ko men ner ma lama. Ni mo ter ma le focus ma yele me le medda. Ba be ke be lu moten mo chandam. Biche yika lu meddo du tunu kurak dundu tundur dambi shalga mani bruma sartam ido moto yika kuma mo shibr.
It could be argued that arrogance was displayed on both sides. The erroneous report by the Pang spy regarding the weaponry of the British Army cost them a lot. But the worst show of arrogance was the conclusion that they could defeat the British army. They decided to go into the British camp at Sharam to desecrate their horses by cutting the horses' tails to be used as spoils of war or evidence of defeat.
Du met ko du chan dank brang ko du chin kam she dang brang do me o ji to chan ma bindiga ko fot fum bindiga
thì đu mà chấm mà băng mà có cam của đun cả bây tụm đu bi mà như là mà đu tụm chơi yam bi cam mà đu moto mà đu ra đu tụm was moto mà đu tụm chấm mà đu chấm bưng như mà đu chan đằng bi mà đu rem sak đu dir bằng nhìn chấm mà đu mel đan đu chụp bi mà.
Now, about 8 months later, they came back. But before then, Oliver Howard appointed a district colonial officer by name Captain H.D. Fawkes. Several overtures of Captain Fawkes were again disregarded by Megolong of Pang and his aristocrats. So it became necessary that a second expedition, which they called the Angas Patrol, was dispatched from Bauchi to come specifically to invade Pang, which today is Ampang East, in order to secure the submission and also get the taxes which for 8 months they refused to pay to the colonial authorities. The Angas Patrol arrived in the morning of 24th December 1906. That is like Christmas Eve back in England. And the first battle was fought. And according to their own report, there were 13 casualties on the side of Pang troops. But they did not report anything, fatal casualties on the side of the colonialists.
They attempted to subdue Ampang, but it wasn't possible because Ampang was regarded as a notorious area as far as wars and battles were concerned. They had a general commander who was reputed as an unconquerable warrior. His name was JASH. He was the Garkwa of Ampang. And he was the, if you like, the general commander of the Pang troops. Until that time, it wasn't possible to defeat the people of Pang in any communal conflict or any communal battle. And Jash's name was a very well-known name in its neighborhood. So he was actually the person that was in charge of the troops. It had to take the colonialists several expeditions to come to conquer Pang. During the first invasion, when they came, they could see very clearly that it wasn't going to be possible for them to subdue, particularly Kuwang, the headquarters of Ampang, as it is located on top of the hill. And Jash, was very well organized with his troops, just using arrows and bows. But occupying strategic positions, it was not easy to defeat them.
When Saraji, but you sark Jidima, Oma Jimodum Lery, when Saraji Tir Sharam. Koyal Giba and Karfunuma, Mofatanage A, Omaro Mamet Kirat. They went around Jerunge. Koyal Bet Kilere, Wabakin, Omaye, Modern Minir Buddha, Yavaman on it, Kawa.
They fought with the people of Garam and took some tribute tax from there and then decided to come back to the headquarters of Pang, which is Kuwang, in case the king and his aristocrats would have decided to surrender. They arrived Kuwang on the 1st of January 1907, only to receive a shocking news. The Ngolong of Pang, for this period, since the first invasion of April, May, and even up to this December, January period of 1906 and 1907, was named Jidema. They discovered that Jidema had disappeared overnight. He was around on the evening of 31st December 1906. But when morning broke, he was not there. And the only conclusion we make out of that is that the king had gone on self-exile. And that very morning, the situation on ground necessitated their selecting and appointing of a new king.
After the resistance and refusal to submit to a so-called higher authority, Jidema went into a self-imposed exile. He decided that he would rather abdicate his throne than be subservient to the colonial masters. Jidema's self-imposed exile meant the appointment of a new Ngolong, and Wagyur was the popular choice for the throne.
And after the appointment of Wagyur, there was need for talks in case the leaders of Pang were ready to declare their surrender and pay tax to the colonial authorities. There are talks in the morning of that 1st January 1907 that they hit a deadlock. Later in the afternoon, they still had talks. And for the first time, Pang as a state partially capitulated to colonial submission to colonial authority when they decided to give some things as a sign of submission or at least appeasement. 42 sheep were given, plus some jars of African olive oil. We call it mirpet in our language. In Hausa, it's called ma atili. And some other goods were given. But in Captain Folk's personal report, he said he'd said nothing when those overtures were made. So it was clear by the evening of 1st January 1907 that resort to the use of firearms was inevitable.
The refusal and resistance meant that the British Army had to resolve to armed conflict. During the encounter with the British Army in January of 1907, Pang soldiers found out the hard way that those sticks were not just sticks, but some sort of special weapons.
Since the first encounter, which was on the 24th of December, the Pan people realized that the colonial soldiers had superiority of weapons. They had sling stones, arrows, swords, spears, facing an enemy that had guns. And even they had the magazine gun, which was a machine gun. So they resorted to engage the enemy by means of guerrilla warfare. So even on that 2nd of January, the engagements were more of that type, guerrilla style kind of engagement. They would attack and run off quickly. But in each time, the rebuttals from the colonial sides were devastating. Different earth grades were sent, one after the other. And according to the book of Professor Daniel Wambuda, he said it was in the 3rd formation, the 3rd the attack, that the man known as Gurkawa JASH decided to go to the battle himself. Gurkawa is a title, and it's clear that it is an adaptation of the Hausa title Garkuwa, or defender. In my own essays, I also call him General Commander of the troops of Pang, which today is approximately represented by Ampang East district.
JASH was a warrior. In Ngas, to be specific, is Pang, present day of Ampang district. And in Hausa, he was like the Garkuwa. And when you know what a warrior stands for, it shows that he was the defender of Ngas land. In English, I will confidently tell you that he was the Minister of Defense for the Pang people, and by extension, the Ngas land. But the little I know about JASH is when the colonial masters came, and at the course of their conquering some communities in Ngas land, when they came to Pang area, there was that stick defense led by the JASH. And in fact, you know, they liked the plain land or Igbo, while the Pang people were on the hills. So when the warriors were coming towards Sharam area, you know, where the Plateau College is, you discover that they were so strong for the white man, and the white man was using gun, and you know our people were using bow and arrows and other God-given war tools from our community.
So when the king Jidma was there, who later went into self-exile, and the new king Wagyur was appointed, they were working in consultation with this general commander who was in charge of the army, of the troops of Ampang East. Having now resorted to using different age grades, and he realized the battle was not favoring them, he decided to go into the war himself.
Albert Kilere, Wabakin, Omaye, Mudan Mini Buddha, Yabamana, Kawa, Lokachira, Barsar, JASH, Hero Kawa. When you royal Melerda, the Timpokin, or Matuma, Mayak Quaker, Nasara, Kinkin. Kumayal, Iban Nasara, Demdel Kam Gama, Piama Pachar and Jang, Banasara, Mini, your pass for Maya, Kamma, much more be win. Much more be win, Banasara, Mangshima. Okay, can you Rumini? What go young Kwang Wiema, Mokwa Shak for Tumpat, Bamang Wang Kikima, Arang Bagabot.
But I must mention that on that second, the palace Oluwarang of Pang that was first partially burnt on Christmas Day was again finally burnt on the 2nd of January. The colonial troops penetrated and burnt it. Secondly, Wangsur, which is the official residence of the Gurkawa and of course other title holders like the Ngopopong of Wangsur and other princes, the bastion of princes, was also burnt. It seems to me that that must have been the last straw that broke the proverbial camel's back, because after that, JASH now decided to go.
As earlier stated, the British soldiers were camped at Sharam. Pang warriors approached them from the top of Mount Galtam, relying on their information obtained from their spy. Pang soldiers were shooting their arrows down at their enemies from the top of the mountain, while the British soldiers fired at them uphill. Of course, the firepower was too much for Pang, and they ran further up the hill towards Kuwang, the headquarters of Pang. The Colonialists followed closely behind, chasing them into Kuwang. and camped at Potuan, the watering hole, to wait them out.
Kerin waka minyi ba fara piak wak ma. Fosh wuske ke shwe mo ngermo. Nyang pima. Ba man karmo so. Ba yit pinyi. Ba ke terlu. Pa am funu jang minyi man am prata Potuan. Ke terlu gi. Ba ta terlu gi. Ba to ko ka ba mo long ma jincha. Ba mo jika. Ba chok fi chong ma ba ma jincha ba jika. Tong kak gi. Lok ba ma gele ma je ba le ma te gi tong yesika ye jika. Ara mo je. Ba ye jidema. Ba ma garo nye. To ma nang ba chi te garo. Ye ma garo nye.
And when they got to that point in time, that was when the Oyibo noticed they were strong coming up and decided to use his gun. And you know, when you know the physics of gun, you notice that the force that gives out is a little bit stronger than our arrow. So it exerted that force. That's why he now got to JASH when he shot at him and he fell down.
And this time around, the engagement was not in Kuwang itself. They went down near the camp of the colonial troops in Sharam. And it was at a place known as Goltom that JASH threw himself into the forefront of the battle. And he was gunned down by the machine gun. Some sources said by Captain Fox himself. Whether it was by Captain Fox himself or by any of the colonial soldiers, the point remains that someone who was a reputed hero and indeed the general commander shot. All through the years that JASH had occupied the office of Grikawa and had led the troops in battles, other battles, Pang had not been defeated before. To such an extent that the soldiers of Pang had come to assume that he was invincible. They believed nobody could pull him down.
That's why there's this popular say that JASH said, Magatu, Magabad JASH, Kurok, Sharame. So, meaning that what has pushed JASH down at Sharam. And not that he died there, because being a warrior, he was really fortified. And after he got that gunshot, he survived it. He was able to make it back home to Pang. And it was in Pang that the wound he sustained, he couldn't survive it.
The loss recorded by Pang on that day wasn't just in property and material things. It was a defeat of their dignity and pride. It destroyed the long-standing streak that Pang had never been defeated by an outside force, and this demoralized the people, but most especially the soldiers.
When Grikawa JASH was killed, the attitude of the soldiers of Pang was clearly that of discouragement. They ran away. And there is an invocation that has remained immemorializing JASH, which goes in our language thus: Brr Yamakubba JASH Pede, which translates as Brr, which is just an exclamation. What is it that can push JASH down? When they said that, they ran away. But they did not declare any surrender. They did not concede defeat. Lo and behold, he was killed on that fateful day. So, apart from the destruction of the palace, the destruction of Wongsu, where the Garkwa officially resided, the colonial soldiers on that same day broke into other houses and took away grain resources, goods or grain resources, totaling 390 bags. They were carried off on that second day. So on the third day, the colonial soldiers who had already done those things on the second, destroyed part of the palace, destroyed Wangsu, took away 390 loads of goods. They continued with the breaking of houses in Kuwang and adjacent communities like Uye, Kagar, Kadam. These communities were invaded and loads of grains were taken away.